April 17th, 1945. Apeldoorn, the Netherlands. Sergeant Herb Pike of the 48th Highlanders of Canada walked into a town that looked, from a distance, like it had survived the war. The buildings were mostly intact. The streets were clear. There were no shell craters, no collapsed rooftops, no smoldering wreckage. But something was wrong. People were standing along the road, hundreds of them, then thousands. They were cheering. They were waving flags that had been hidden for 5 years. Some were crying. And Herb Pike, 23 years old, a man who had fought his way from Sicily, through Italy, and across the Rhine, could not stop staring at their faces. They were skeletal. Women who looked 60 turned out to be 30. Children stood on legs so thin Pike could see the shape of the bone through their skin. A man reached toward the convoy and collapsed before his hand touched the truck. The Dutch were cheering their liberators, and their liberators were watching them die. Pike would remember this for the rest of his life. Not the sound of the crowd, not the flags, the faces. He said later that the civilians were in terrible shape, that their health was destroyed, that they had been eating tulip bulbs just to stay alive. But here is what Herb Pike did not yet know, what no Canadian soldier rolling into the Netherlands that spring fully understood. The people of Apeldoorn were not the worst cases. They were not even close. Apeldoorn was in the east, where farms still grew food and some supply lines still functioned. Behind the German positions, to the west, in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, in The Hague, 3 million people were trapped in a famine so severe that 20,000 had already died, and hundreds more were dying every day. The Canadians had found the edge of a catastrophe. The center of it was still 60 kilometers away, behind enemy guns, and completely out of reach. This is the story of what Canadian soldiers discovered when they pushed into the Netherlands in the spring of 1945, and what they did when they realized that winning the war would not be enough to save the people they had come to free. If this story deserves to be heard, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who care about them. To understand what the Canadians walked into, you need to understand what happened 7 months earlier. And it starts with an act of extraordinary courage by ordinary Dutch people. An act that was supposed to help win the war, and instead nearly destroyed a nation. September 17, 1944. The Dutch government in exile, sitting safely in London, sent a message to the people of the occupied Netherlands. The message was simple: go on strike, shut down the railways. The Allies were launching Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault aimed at punching through the Netherlands and crossing the Rhine into Germany. If the Dutch railway workers stopped the trains, German reinforcements could not move. The strike could shorten the war by months. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the country, 30,000 railway workers walked off the job. Trains stopped, stations went dark. The Dutch had bet everything on the Allies breaking through. The Allies did not break through. Market Garden failed at Arnhem. The British paratroopers were crushed. The Great Bridge was never taken. And the railway workers, who had risked their lives on a promise, were left exposed. In an occupied country, with no liberation coming, and a Nazi administration that had just been humiliated. Remember that date, September 27th, 1944, because on that day, the German military commander in the Netherlands, Friedrich Christiansen, signed an order that would sentence millions of people to starvation. In retaliation for the railway strike, the Germans imposed an embargo on all food transport from the agricultural east to the densely populated west. No grain, no potatoes, no milk, no meat. Nothing. The Western Netherlands, home to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, held nearly half the country's population in a strip of land smaller than Connecticut. These cities had almost no farmland. They depended entirely on food shipped in from the countryside, and overnight, that supply was gone. The embargo was supposed to be temporary, a punishment, a message. But the Dutch railway workers refused to go back. The strike held through October, through November, through the winter, and by the time the Germans partially lifted the embargo in November, it was already too late. The canal system that could have moved food by water had frozen solid in one of the coldest winters in decades. The roads were impassable. The distribution networks had collapsed, and 3 million people began to starve. What happened next, over the following 5 months, is one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of Western Europe. And when the Canadians finally reached it, when they saw with their own eyes what starvation had done to an entire civilization, it changed them. Some of them never spoke about it. Others could not stop. But before the Canadians could find what was waiting behind those German lines, something else had to happen first. Something no one in the Allied High Command was willing to do, and something two junior Canadian officers decided to do on their own, in a jeep, with a white bedsheet and a bottle of whiskey. By November 1944, the Western Netherlands had entered a period the Dutch would call the Hongerwinter, the Hunger Winter, and the word hunger does not come close. In Amsterdam, a city of 800,000 people, the official daily ration dropped to 600 calories, then 500. Then, by February 1945, 340. A single slice of bread and a bowl of watery soup made from sugar beets. That was a day's food for a grown man, for a mother, for a child. To put that number in perspective, a Canadian soldier's daily ration was over 3,000 calories. What a man in Amsterdam received in a week, a private from Saskatchewan ate before lunch. The things people did to survive would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Families stripped wallpaper from their walls and boiled the paste for the flour and the glue. They pulled up floorboards and burned them for heat because fuel had vanished along with food. They ate dogs, cats, rats. In the streets of Rotterdam, people chased seagulls. In The Hague, women stood in lines for hours to receive a single ladle of soup made from tulip bulbs. Bulbs that had been sitting in warehouses, meant for the spring planting season, and were now the last source of carbohydrates in the city. Tulip bulbs taste bitter. They cause nausea. They are difficult to digest. But they kept people alive for one more day, and one more day was all anyone was counting on. The Dutch called them hungertochten, hunger treks. Thousands of people, mostly women, walked east from the cities into the countryside, on foot or on bicycles with no tires, carrying whatever they could trade. A wedding ring for a bag of potatoes, a silver spoon for a loaf of bread, a family clock for a sack of wheat. They walked 20, 30, 40 kilometers in freezing temperatures, and some of them never came back. They collapsed on the roads. They froze in ditches. And the farmers who had food to give were overwhelmed. There were too many hands reaching, too many mouths open, and the Germans were still confiscating whatever they could find. 40 to 50,000 children were evacuated from the western cities to the countryside. Mothers put their sons and daughters on carts and sent them to strangers, because strangers in the east had food, and mothers in Amsterdam did not. And while this was happening, while 20,000 people slowly died, the man responsible for the occupation sat down to Christmas dinner. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Rijkskommissar of the Netherlands, celebrated Christmas 1944 at his official residence in Clingendale, outside The Hague. The menu included 3 kinds of meat and 2 flavors of ice cream. The streets outside his gates were full of people who had not eaten a real meal in weeks. He knew. He had imposed the embargo himself, and he ate his dinner. Here is where the story takes a turn that should make you angry, and not only at the Germans. The Allies knew. They had known since October. Dutch officials had been sending desperate messages to London. Queen Wilhelmina had written personally to King George and President Roosevelt, begging for military action, or, failing that, massive food relief. Prince Bernhard, commander of Dutch forces and son-in-law of the Queen, had pleaded with Eisenhower directly, but the answer, again and again, was the same. The priority was defeating Germany. Every truck, every plane, every ton of fuel was needed for the push into the Rhineland. Feeding civilians behind enemy lines was a logistical impossibility and a strategic risk. Food sent to the occupied Netherlands might end up feeding German soldiers. Churchill said so explicitly. The Allied High Command agreed. The Dutch would have to wait. And so, they waited. Through January, through February, through March. And every week, the death toll climbed. By April, the bread ration had fallen to 400 grams per week, less than a single loaf, divided across 7 days for an entire family. Bodies were stacking up in churches because the ground was too frozen to dig graves, and there was no fuel to run hearses. In Amsterdam, the death rate was 6 times higher than it had been before the war. The Dutch resistance sent a message through illegal channels. Amsterdam had bread for 5 days. After that, nothing. This was the country the 1st Canadian Army was advancing into. Not a battlefield in the traditional sense. Not a place where victory meant capturing a hill or crossing a river. This was a place where victory meant reaching 3 million people before they died. And the Canadians were still fighting their way through German positions, town by town, canal by canal, losing men every day. more than 1,000 killed in April alone, while the clock ran down on an entire nation. The Canadians who had already crossed into the eastern Netherlands had seen the edges of the famine. They had seen the thin faces, the hollow eyes, the children reaching for anything a soldier might hand them. But what waited in the west was something else entirely. And reaching it would require something that no army on earth had tried before: negotiating with the enemy to save the enemy's own hostages, while the war was still being fought. The first attempt at that negotiation would not come from a general. It would come from a captain who wrote books about wolves. April 1945. The 1st Canadian Army was the largest army ever commanded by a Canadian general. Under General Harry Crerar, it included 2 Canadian corps, a British corps, a Polish armored division, and at various times, American, Belgian, and Dutch units. It stretched across a 360-mile front from Dunkirk to the North Sea, and in the final weeks of the war, its primary mission was the Netherlands. But liberating the Netherlands was not like liberating France. In France, the Canadians had used every weapon they had: massed artillery, airstrikes, armored columns. In the Netherlands, they could not. The country was flat, threaded with canals, and packed with civilians. A single misplaced barrage could kill the very people the Canadians had come to save. Worse, the Germans had flooded vast stretches of farmland as a defensive measure, and Allied intelligence knew they were prepared to blow the dikes along the North Sea coast. If the dikes went, the ocean would pour into western Holland. A quarter of the Netherlands sits below sea level. The flooding would not just kill thousands, it would drown cities. So the Canadians fought a different kind of war: careful, slow, costly. And every town they entered told the same story. On April 9th, Lieutenant W.J. Trump and Trooper W.H.G. Ritchie of the Fort Garry Horse rolled into Ritsen, a small town east of the IJssel River. They were met by Dutch civilians who came running out of their homes, waving, shouting, some of them weeping. And then Trump and Ritchie saw the children. The children were thin in a way that soldiers from Manitoba had never seen. Not thin like hungry, thin like something was consuming them from inside. Trump reached into his ration kit, pulled out a packet of chewing gum, and handed it down. The photograph of that moment, a Canadian trooper in a beret leaning from his vehicle to hand gum to a Dutch child, would become one of the most reproduced images of the liberation. But what the photograph does not show is what was happening 2 towns away on the same day. German paratroopers and SS units were still fighting. They were teenagers in some cases, boys from training battalions, but they fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, and Canadians were dying. On April 15th, in Apeldoorn, a German artillery shell killed Private Harry Brott. The same bombardment destroyed the home of a Dutch woman named Nelly Vandenberg. She survived. Harry did not. After the war, Nelly wrote to Harry's widow, Ruth, to tell her how her husband had died and where he had fallen. The 2 women, one Canadian, one Dutch, had never met. They wrote to each other for decades. Think about that for a moment. A Canadian soldier dies liberating a Dutch town. A Dutch woman whose house was destroyed by the same shell that killed him writes to his wife 3,000 miles away, and they stay in touch for 40 years. That is the kind of bond this liberation created, not between countries, between people. 2 days after Harry Brott was killed, the Canadians liberated Apeldoorn. 150,000 people would pour into the streets to greet them, but in April 1945, the celebration was complicated by something the soldiers had not been trained for. They were not just liberators. They were the first source of food these people had seen in months. Canadian soldiers began handing out everything they had: chocolate bars from their composite ration packs, biscuits, canned meat, chewing gum, cigarettes. They gave away their own meals to people who weighed less than the packs on their backs. And the Dutch, who had been surviving on tulip soup and sugar beet pulp, received their first taste of chocolate in years from the hands of 20-year-old boys from Toronto and Winnipeg and Halifax. A 7-year-old girl named Lisbeth Kalf lived in Apeldoorn. When the Canadians arrived, a unit of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals set up in her neighborhood. The soldiers adopted her. They made her an honorary captain. They gave her rank insignia and unit shoulder flashes, and her mother sewed them onto a blue sweater. Lisbeth wore that sweater every day. She kept it for 74 years, through marriage, through children, through a life that stretched from wartime Holland to peacetime Canada, before donating it to a military museum in Kingston, Ontario in 2018. But here is what every Canadian soldier in Apeldoorn understood by the end of that first week. The people they were feeding, the children they were giving chocolate to, the families whose lives they were saving one ration pack at a time. These were the lucky ones. These were the people in the East, where some food had trickled through, where farms still functioned, where the famine had been severe but not total. The West was different. The West was behind the Grebe line, the German defensive position that ran from Wageningen through Amersfoort to the sea. Behind that line sat Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. 3 million people. No food, no fuel, no medicine. And the German 25th Army, 100,000 strong, stood between the Canadians and every one of them. Fighting through would take weeks the Dutch did not have, and bombing the German positions would risk the dikes. The Canadians needed another way in, and on April 26th, 2 men decided to make one. Captain Farley Mowat was 24 years old and had been at war since he was 19. He had landed in Sicily with the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, fought through Ortona in the bloodiest urban battle Canadians had ever seen, and survived the Italian campaign with a reputation for 2 things: being an excellent intelligence officer and being completely unpredictable. He wrote constantly: letters, journals, observations. He would later become one of Canada's most famous authors, known for books about wolves and whales and the Arctic. But in April 1945, he was not writing about wolves. He was trying to figure out how to feed 3 million people. The message had come through the Dutch resistance, vague, unverified. It said that the German commander in Western Holland, General Johannes Blaskowitz, wanted to discuss the civilian food crisis with the Canadians. No details, no guarantees, no safe conduct pass. Just a message that the German side was willing to talk. At Canadian intelligence headquarters, the message was discussed and mostly dismissed. It could be a trap. It could be misinformation. It could be nothing. But 2 men decided it was worth the risk. Major Ken Cottam, British-born, fluent in German, with a talent for bluffing, and Captain Farley Mowat, who later admitted he thought the whole thing was insane, but went anyway. They brought one more man, Sergeant Doc MacDonald, Mowat's orderly. 3 men in a single jeep. On the morning of April 26th, they tied a white bedsheet to the wire cutter on the front of the jeep and drove straight toward the German lines. Picture this. The war is still on. Canadian and German soldiers are killing each other within earshot, and 3 men in an open vehicle with a bedsheet for a flag are driving directly into the teeth of the German 25th Army. Mowat later said he expected to be cut down by machine gun fire at any moment. He thought they would not make it past the first checkpoint. They made it past the first checkpoint. Cottam did the talking. His German was flawless, his manner was commanding, and the message he carried, however vague, referenced General Blaskowitz by name. The sentries were nervous but let them through. At the second checkpoint, the same thing happened. At the third, the Germans assigned them a motorcycle escort. 3 Canadians, surrounded by German soldiers, driving deeper into occupied territory. By nightfall, they had reached the headquarters of the German 25th Army, a heavily guarded bunker complex, and were admitted to see General Blaskowitz. What exactly was said in that room? How many bottles were opened? And how much of the negotiation was formal versus improvised? The accounts vary. Mowat himself told the story with different details over the years, as soldiers who have lived through absurd moments tend to do. But the outcome is not in dispute. Late that night, Cottam and Mowat sent a message back to Canadian headquarters. They had negotiated a truce. The Germans would allow food deliveries to the civilian population of Western Holland. Airdrops would not be fired upon. Truck convoys would be permitted to cross the lines. Mowat later said he expected either a promotion or a court-martial. He received neither. What he and Cottam did not know was that their freelance diplomacy had been running in parallel with something much larger. At the highest levels of the Allied command, the same negotiation was already underway, and it was far more fragile than anything settled over whiskey in a German bunker. On April 28th, in a schoolhouse in the village of Achterveld, a tiny Dutch town that now sat in Canadian-controlled territory, British Air Commodore Andrew Geddes and General Freddy de Gingand sat across from a delegation of German officers. The subject was the same: food for the Western Netherlands. But the German officers at Achterveld had no authority to agree. They could only listen and report back to one man, Arthur Seyss Inquart, the same man who had imposed the food embargo, the the same man who had eaten 3 kinds of meat while his subjects starved. The decision on whether millions of Dutch civilians would be fed, or whether the famine would continue until the war ground to its end, rested with the man most responsible for creating the famine in the first place. 2 days later, on April 30th, a second meeting was held. This time, General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, a man known throughout the Allied forces as Ike's Hatchet Man, met Seyss-Inquart face to face. Bedell Smith did not negotiate gently. He told the Reichskommissar that if the Germans did not cooperate, he would face a firing squad. Seyss-Inquart looked at the American general and said that threat left him cold. Bedell Smith did not blink. He said it usually does. But Seyss-Inquart agreed. Whether out of calculation, fear, or a sudden interest in building a defense for his inevitable war crimes trial, the deal was done. Allied aircraft would be permitted to drop food into 5 designated zones in the occupied West. German anti-aircraft guns would hold fire. Truck convoys would follow. There was only one problem. The agreement had been made on paper. No one knew whether the Germans on the ground, the gun crews, the sentries, the nervous 18-year-olds manning the flak batteries, would actually hold their fire when 400 bombers appeared overhead at 500 feet. On the morning of April 29th, before Seyss-Inquart had even formally signed anything, a single Lancaster bomber lifted off from an airfield in England to find out. The Lancaster was called Bad Penny. The name came from the old expression, a bad penny always turns up. Her pilot was Flying Officer Robert Upcott, 22 years old, from Windsor, Ontario. 5 of the 7 crew members were Canadian, and on the morning of April 29, 1945, they were flying a mission unlike anything Bomber Command had ever attempted. The bomb bay was loaded, but not with bombs. It carried sacks of flour, canned meat, dried vegetables, and chocolate, packed in heavy paper and stacked where 12,000-pound blockbusters normally sat. There were no parachutes attached. The food would simply fall, and to keep it from splattering across the Dutch countryside, Bad Penny had to fly low, not bombing altitude low enough to see faces on the ground. The briefing had been short. Fly within the designated corridor. Drop to 500 feet over the zone. Do not deviate. Do not carry gunners. And understand that the Germans have not yet formally agreed to any of this. That last detail bears repeating. Seyss-Inquart would not formally approve the food drops until the following day, April 30th, the same day Adolf Hitler shot himself in a bunker beneath Berlin. On the morning of the 29th, the truce existed only as a verbal understanding between men who had been trying to kill each other for 5 years. If a single German flak crew decided the agreement did not apply to them, Bad Penny and her crew of 7 would be shredded at point-blank range. Upcott brought the Lancaster across the Dutch coast at low altitude. The crew could see the anti-aircraft positions. They could see the gun barrels. One crew member on a later flight described watching the flak guns track them, following the aircraft as it passed, the barrels swiveling to keep pace, but never firing. Like being watched through a rifle scope by a man who has not yet decided whether to pull the trigger. The guns did not fire. Bad Penny reached the drop zone, opened her bomb bay, and released her cargo. The sacks tumbled out and hit the ground. Below, Dutch civilians who had been told by Radio Oranje that planes would come, and who had barely dared to believe it, watched food fall from the sky. Bad Penny turned for home. The crew radioed 2 words, mission accomplished. Within hours, Operation Manna was fully underway. 239 Lancasters followed Bad Penny that first day, dropping 535 tons of food across 5 locations. The next day, the day Hitler died and Seyss-Inquart signed the formal agreement, they dropped over 1,000 tons more. British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and Polish air crews flew sortie after sortie, day after day, at altitudes so low they could read the messages the Dutch had painted on rooftops and spread across fields with bedsheets. Thank you. God bless you. Many thanks, boys. The Lancasters that had spent years destroying German cities were now saving a Dutch one. Bomb aimers, who had dropped incendiaries on Hamburg, were lining up flour sacks over The Hague. The same aircraft, the same crews, a completely different war. On May 1st, the Americans joined with Operation Chowhound. Nearly 400 B-17 Flying Fortresses, bombers built to fly at 20,000 feet, came in at 300, their modified bomb bays packed with K rations. Each ration box contained 3 meals and roughly 3,000 calories. For a person who had been surviving on 340 calories a day, a single K ration box was more food than they had eaten in a week. And that was the problem. Some of the Dutch who received the first drops could not wait. They tore open the packages and ate immediately, and some of them became violently ill. Others died, not from starvation, from eating. It is called refeeding syndrome, when a body that has been starved for months suddenly receives food, especially food rich in fat and sugar. The metabolic shock can stop the heart. The cruelest detail of the hunger winter was that for some, the food that was meant to save them arrived just in time to kill them. Distribution was another disaster. The food fell in designated zones, but getting it from the drop fields to the people who needed it most, the bedridden, the elderly, the children too weak to walk, took days. In Amsterdam, it would take until May 10th for mana supplies to actually reach civilians. In The Hague, May 11th, people continued to die while crates of food sat in fields 3 kilometers away, because there were no trucks, no fuel, and no organization left to move them. The air crews knew this. Allied planners knew this. The airdrops were saving lives, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives, but they were not enough. The tonnage was too small. The distribution was too slow. 3 million people cannot be fed from the sky. They needed roads. They needed trucks. They needed convoys carrying not hundreds but thousands of tons, driven directly into the occupied cities and unloaded at distribution points. And that meant sending Canadian soldiers, unarmed, in soft-skinned vehicles, straight through German lines, past the 100,000 enemy troops who had not yet surrendered, into cities they had never seen, to feed people they had never met. The operation was given a name, Faust. And on the morning of May 2nd, 1945, 360 trucks started their engines. Lieutenant Colonel E.A. de Geer set up his headquarters 300 yards from the German front line. 300 yards. Close enough to hear voices from the other side. Close enough that a German sniper, had he chosen to break the truce, would not have needed a scope. De Geer's job was to organize the largest humanitarian convoy of the war. Operation Faust would use trucks from the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, the same trucks that had carried ammunition, fuel, and rations across France, Belgium, and the Rhineland, and send them, loaded with food, directly into German-held territory. The convoys would cross at a single point on the road between Wageningen and Rhenen. They would be unarmed. They would carry white flags, and they would drive past tens of thousands of German soldiers who were, technically, still the enemy. At 7:30 on the morning of May 2nd, the first trucks rolled. Within 24 hours, the operation had scaled to 30 vehicles crossing the truce line every 30 minutes, 12 transport platoons, 8 Canadian, 4 British, running 360 trucks around the clock, 1,000 tons of food per day. The drivers were young Canadians. Many of them were the same men who had driven supply routes under shell fire in Normandy and the Scheldt. They knew how to handle a truck in a war zone, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for what they saw on the other side of the line. The first thing was the silence. Western Holland was a country that had stopped moving. There were no cars. The Germans had confiscated all fuel months ago. There were no bicycles. The Germans had confiscated those too, for metal. The trams in Amsterdam and Rotterdam sat frozen on their tracks, dead and rusting. The streets of cities that had held hundreds of thousands of people were nearly empty, because the people who lived there no longer had the energy to walk. Then, the drivers saw the people themselves. In the eastern Netherlands, the Canadians had encountered hunger, thin faces, gaunt children, people who were malnourished but still standing, still cheering, still running toward the trucks. In the West, they found something different. They found people who could not stand, people sitting against walls, too weak to rise, people lying in doorways, people who looked at the Canadian trucks with expressions that the drivers struggled to describe afterward. Not joy, not relief, but something closer to disbelief, as if the trucks were a hallucination, as if food arriving in a vehicle was something from a world that no longer existed. The children were the hardest thing. Canadian soldiers, boys of 19 and 20, from farms in Ontario and fishing villages in Nova Scotia, stood in the backs of trucks and handed down crates to crowds that pressed forward, with a desperation that was physical, involuntary, beyond politeness or order. Mothers held up infants, old men reached with hands that shook, And the soldiers, who had bullets and grenades and years of combat behind them, found themselves doing the only thing that mattered anymore: handing a tin of meat to a woman who weighed 30 kilograms, giving a chocolate bar to a child who had never tasted one. Remember Tony Romaine, 5 years old, living in Harlem. He said later simply, "We never had candy." His family had survived the winter on boiled tulip bulbs. The first sweet thing he ever tasted came from the hand of a Canadian soldier. There were thousands of Tony Romaines, tens of thousands, an entire generation of Dutch children whose first memory of kindness after years of occupation was a Canadian in a uniform giving them something to eat. 80 years later, their children and grandchildren still tell the story, not because it was extraordinary by the standards of war, but because it was extraordinary by the standards of what they had been living through. In a world where people had eaten their pets and burned their furniture to survive the night, a stranger handing you a biscuit was the most radical act of humanity imaginable. The convoys kept rolling, May 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. On May 5th, the day General Charles Foulkes accepted the surrender of all German forces in the Netherlands, in the town of Wageningen, Operation Faust did not stop. The Germans had surrendered, but 3 million people were still hungry. The trucks kept going. 200 Canadian vehicles remained on food distribution missions long after the war officially ended, driving deeper into the cities, reaching neighborhoods that had been cut off for months, finding people who had not known the war was over because they no longer had the strength to leave their homes. The drivers from the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps did not fire a shot in Western Holland. They carried no weapons across the truce line. And yet what they did in those 9 days saved more lives than most combat operations of the entire war. It is estimated that Operations Manna, Chowhound, and Faust together saved approximately 1 million Dutch people from starvation. 1 million. But here is the part of the story that does not appear in the operational reports, the part that has nothing to do with tonnage or logistics or the number of trucks per hour, the part that explains why, 80 years later, the Dutch do something that no other nation in Europe does for any liberator. They remember, not as history, as family. In the weeks after the surrender, 170,000 Canadian soldiers were stationed across the Netherlands. They were waiting to go home. The war was over, the fighting was done, and most of them wanted nothing more than a ship back to Halifax. But while they waited, through May, June, July, August, something happened that nobody had planned for and no general had ordered. The Dutch took them in, not as occupiers, not as guests to be tolerated until they left, as family. Dutch families opened their homes to Canadian soldiers. They shared meals that were still meager. The famine had ended, but food was not yet plentiful. And they introduced the soldiers to their daughters, their neighbors, their communities. The Canadians, for their part, were not the broken, bitter men that 5 years of occupation had taught the Dutch to expect from soldiers. They were young. They were friendly. Many of them came from farms and small towns, and they understood the rhythm of rural life in a way that surprised the Dutch. They played with children. They helped repair homes. They handed out what they had. And the Dutch women noticed. After 5 years of German occupation, after watching their own men hauled away to forced labor camps or ground down by hunger and humiliation, the Canadians looked, as one Dutch woman remembered decades later, delicious. That is the word she used. The young men from across the Atlantic were healthy, smiling, generous with chocolate and cigarettes, and utterly unlike anyone the women of the Netherlands had encountered in half a decade of war. 1,886 Dutch women married Canadian soldiers. Nell Griefkes was one of them. She had grown up in Amsterdam under occupation. Her father had gone into hiding to avoid being deported to a German labor camp. She had done things to keep her family alive that she could barely speak about afterward. In the summer of 1945, she met a Canadian soldier named Cecil Ringuth. They married. She crossed the Atlantic to a country she had never seen. They raised 6 children together in Canada. Hers was one of nearly 2,000 love stories that began in the ruins of the Hongerwinter, stories that bound 2 countries together not through treaties or diplomacy, but through kitchens and bedrooms and the sound of children who spoke English with Dutch accents. But the bond between Canada and the Netherlands was not built only on love. It was built on graves. 7,600 Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen died in the 9 months it took to liberate the Netherlands. They are buried in war cemeteries scattered across the country. The largest is Groesbeek, near Nijmegen, more than 2,300 Canadians in rows of white headstones on a hill overlooking the flatlands they fought to free. At Holton, in the east, 1,347 Canadians lie in a cemetery surrounded by forest. And what the Dutch do at these cemeteries is something that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. Every year, Dutch school children visit the graves. They are assigned a soldier. They research his name, his regiment, where he came from in Canada. They learn that Private so-and-so was 21, from a town in Saskatchewan they cannot pronounce, and that he was killed on a Tuesday in April 1945, within sight of the town where their own grandmother grew up. And then they place flowers on his headstone. Not once, every year. The same grave, tended by successive generations of Dutch children who have never met the man buried beneath it and never will. At Holton, on Christmas Eve, the entire community turns out in darkness. Every family brings a candle. 1,347 candles are placed, one before each grave. The cemetery glows in the Dutch winter while the town stands in silence. They have done this every year since the war ended. Their parents did it, their grandparents did it, and their children will do it after them. No other liberated nation in Europe does anything like this. France has ceremonies, Belgium has monuments, but the Netherlands has a ritual, personal, familial, unbroken for 80 years, that treats Canadian sacrifice not as a historical event to be commemorated, but as a debt to be honored by name, grave by grave, generation by generation. Why? What makes this bond different? Why do the Dutch remember Canadians with an intensity that startles every Canadian veteran who has ever returned and found a stranger weeping at the sight of his uniform? The answer is not complicated, but it is not what most people expect. It has nothing to do with military strategy, or the number of towns liberated, or the speed of the advance. It has to do with what the Canadians carried in their pockets, what they handed down from the backs of trucks, what they gave away when they had no orders to give anything. It has to do with the tulip bulbs, not the ones the Dutch ate to survive, the ones that came after. During the war, while Canadian soldiers were fighting their way across Europe, a young Dutch woman was living quietly in a large house in Ottawa. Crown Princess Juliana of the Netherlands had fled the German invasion in 1940 with her two daughters, Beatrix and Irene. The British had offered sanctuary, but London was being bombed nightly, and the Dutch government decided that the heir to the throne and her children needed to be farther from the war. Canada took them in. Juliana settled in Ottawa. She lived there for 4 years, shopping on Spark Street, walking her daughters through Rockcliffe Park, attending church on Sundays. The Canadians treated her not as a royal exile, but as a neighbor. And on January 19, 1943, Juliana gave birth to her third daughter at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. The Canadian government did something that had never been done before. It declared the maternity ward temporarily outside Canadian sovereignty, legally extraterritorial, so that the baby would hold exclusively Dutch citizenship and remain in the line of succession. The child was named Margriet. The name means daisy, a flower that had become a symbol of resistance in the occupied Netherlands. When Holland was liberated and Juliana returned home, she sent a gift to the country that had sheltered her family. 100,000 tulip bulbs. They were planted in Ottawa, along the Rideau Canal and on Parliament Hill. And the following spring, they bloomed, a river of color through the capital of a country that had given the Dutch royal family a home and sent its sons to give the Dutch people their country back. The next year, Juliana sent 20,000 more, and the year after that, 20,000 more. The Dutch have never stopped. Every single year for 80 years, 10,000 bulbs from the royal family, 10,000 from the Dutch Bulb Growers Association. Tulips have crossed the Atlantic from the Netherlands to Canada. They bloom every May in Ottawa. 1 million tulips, in over 100 varieties, in a festival that draws hundreds of thousands of visitors who may or may not know why the flowers are there. Here is the thing about the tulips that stops you cold when you think about it. The tulip bulb, the same object, is both the symbol of Dutch suffering and the symbol of Dutch gratitude. The Dutch ate tulip bulbs to survive the winter of 1944, and then they sent tulip bulbs to Canada to say thank you for ending it. The same flower, the darkest chapter and the brightest gesture. The Dutch took the thing that had kept them alive at their lowest moment and turned it into a gift for the people who made sure that moment ended. Farley Mowat came home from the war and wrote 25 books. He never forgot the jeep ride through German lines, and he never stopped telling the story, with varying levels of accuracy and increasing amounts of whiskey, for the rest of his life. He died in 2014, at 92. Lisbeth Kalf, the 7-year-old girl who was made honorary captain by the Canadian Signals Unit in Apeldoorn, grew up, married, became Lisbeth Langford, and moved to a life far from the war. In 2018, at 80 years old, she donated the blue sweater with the captain's insignia to a military museum in Kingston, Ontario. In 2023, she traveled to Nijmegen to meet Canadian veterans visiting the Netherlands. She was 85. She still remembered every name. And Sergeant Herb Pike of the 48th Highlanders, the man who walked into Apeldoorn on April 17, 1945, and could not stop staring at the faces of the people he had come to save, Herb Pike went back. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the liberation, the surviving Canadian veterans returned to the Netherlands. In Apeldoorn, 150,000 Dutch people poured into the streets to meet them. 150,000. For soldiers who had last been there as young men, now white-haired and walking slowly, the sight was overwhelming. The Dutch were not performing a ceremony. They were not honoring a memory. They were greeting people they considered part of their family. Pike said afterward, with the plainness of a man who had seen enough in his life to know the difference between sentiment and truth, the Dutch will truly, truly never forget what the Canadians did. And they let us know that they do not forget. They keep saying they will never forget, and they have not, because they show it to us every time we go over. What did the Canadians find in Holland? They found a nation starving. They found people eating flowers to stay alive. They found children who had never tasted chocolate and old men too weak to stand. And they did the simplest thing soldiers can do. They gave what they had. They handed down food from the backs of trucks, one tin at a time, one chocolate bar at a time, one life at a time. It was not strategy, it was not doctrine, it was human. And 80 years later, the tulips still bloom. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. That means a lot, not to me, but to the soldiers and families in it. If you think this story deserves to reach more viewers, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters. If you are not yet subscribed, now is a good time. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. I would love to know, where are you watching from? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, Canadian, American, British, Australian, Dutch, or anywhere in the Allied forces, tell us in the comments. These stories live because people like you keep them alive.